Hi, peace be upon you, folks. Today, I would like to talk about democracy and the Black Lives Matter movement. People commonly understand democracy as government of the people, for the people, by the people. So you get to vote and decide who your leader is. On paper, this sounds good in theory because then you can prevent yourself from having a dictator and you can have somebody who you elected, who you think is going to represent you well. So ideally, in a democracy, uh, those who can change the laws seek what the people need, what is bothering the people, and then they look for ways so that they can make it better for those people, even if it means changing the law. That's ideally. But what really happens is, unless people have protested and brought these lawmakers to shame, and they have no choice but to actually address the issue. Or, in another case, you have lobbyists who sometimes bribe these lawmakers to get them to pass certain laws. So, if you're wealthy, you have a big company, like a pharmaceutical or an oil company, uh, you can pay a lobbyist that would lobby for you in Congress to make sure that laws get passed that would help your business, that would help your profit maximization. So actually, democracy, as it turns out, is not as good as it is on paper practically, especially in a capitalist society where decisions are made by based on profit maximization and greed of individuals. Now, the United States like to think of itself as the leader of the free world, the beacon, the light bearer of democracy in the modern world. But let's take a look at how elections are carried out in the United States. Now, you get two parties. There are sometimes other parties, and some of them you can't even vote for them in every state. But basically, you have two main parties, giving you basically the illusion of choice. Um, and when you vote by state, so the votes are not counted all together in the whole nation, and then the president decided from the votes as a whole of the nation. Rather, it is taken by states, individual states. So let's say within a state, let's say Texas. Now, if Texas has a certain number of votes that are, let's say, 30 votes, and so basically, a state can have, the states don't have the same number of votes. So a big state with more people can basically have less votes than a smaller state, especially when you look at uh, the how many votes go per every thousand people or every million people, for example. So let's say, for example, a state has a million people, and that state has 10 votes. And let's say another state has only 100,000 people, so 10 times less the number of people. But if it also has 10 votes, then basically each vote in that smaller state counts for more than the votes in the bigger state. So that's one issue. And there's no logical reasoning to say this is how we assign the votes to each state. So that's a downfall right there. Now, in each state, the votes are counted all together, and the winner of that state gets all the votes. So, in the two party system, Democrats and Republicans, let's say in that state, let's say Texas, Republicans had 60% of the votes and Democrats had 40%. If there are 10 votes and you go in by percentage, you would expect that The Republicans should have 6 of those votes, and the Democrats 4 of those votes. But that's not how it happens. The winner, even if it's by a very small margin, gets all the votes. So the Republicans will get all the 10 votes for that state. So basically, if you're married and you're a man and your wife, and you're going to vote for the opposite parties, you may as well just stay home, because your votes are going to negate each other. Your votes are going to cancel each other, because only the winner goes, even if it's by one margin. So unless you're both going to vote for the same person, you may as well just stay home and save yourself the time of standing in the line and all that. That's another thing. Now, after the votes are counted, and let's say Republicans won that state, it doesn't mean the Republican candidate is going to get those votes. That's what you would expect, because that's what the people voted for. So first of all, the votes are not divided by the percentage of how the votes were cast, the total. The winner takes all. Now, even after that winner takes all, what you're doing is you're telling the representative of that state how you want them to vote. So if the Republicans take the vote, let's say by 55 to 45, you're basically telling the representative of that state, let's say Texas, that you want that state to vote for the Republican candidate. That's all you're doing in your vote. But that person is not obliged to follow what the voters want, to follow what the people of that state want. He can decide, all right, they want to vote Republican, but I think the Democrats, I should vote Democrat because it's a better candidate. So all you're doing is saying, this is how I want you to vote. You're not even voting, you're not even technically selecting the candidate. But even at that person who you're telling how you want them to vote, they can vote opposite of what you want them to vote. So every state would have a representative. And these representatives are part of what they call the electoral college. So technically and basically, the electoral college decides who who is the next president, because they can choose to follow the votes of their states, or they can vote independently of their states, opposite to what the states decided they wanted to vote for. Now, there should be an outrage. Why has this not been changed? Why has this not been changed? But you don't see an outrage, and many people don't even know this is what happens. And the only other country that has a similar type of voting system and democracy with the United States is France. So the other countries actually have a better system, a more just system of voting and selecting the president than the United States and France. So how is it that they think the leader of the free world? Now, that's about voting. In a democracy also, the people get to decide what the laws are, basically. What is popular within the nation, you can have that passed as the law. So, for example, you can have gay marriage being banned, unlawful, but then with time, they can change that and say, well, the people want it to be lawful now, so we can have that be lawful now. So it's just a matter of how society moves, how society evolves. That's basically democracy. Now, in Islam, as a result, you can't have such a democracy, because in an Islamic state that follows the Sharia and the legislation of God, we know that the more people fall into sin, the more perverse they get with respect to that. So it's like rolling down a hill. The more you get further and further down, whilst generations that come later and later tend to think things are normal. If you look at even the way people used to dress not even long ago, maybe like 100 years ago, it's a lot different from how they dress now. People have lost a lot of shyness, they've lost a lot of shame. But so the more the people who are born in this generation, the easier it is for them to accept and think this is normal. So that's democracy. In Islam, even by definition, you can't have that, because Islam is total submission to the will of God, the Creator. And Muslim is a one who submits to the will of God. So your laws in Islam are based on the legislation of God, based on the Quran and the teachings of the prophets, especially the last prophet. So there are things that God has said, this is forbidden, and things that God has said, this is allowed. And we cannot change that. We do not reform Islam. It wouldn't make sense. To reform Islam, when Islam means submission to the will of God, then once you reformed it, then you're no longer submitting to the will of God. So Islam is not meant to be reformed. Instead, Islam is meant to reform the people. It's meant to reform the society. Bring the people to the submission of God, which is better actually than submitting to your desires, because that is just going to end up with more sin and immorality and the wrath of God. So God has given a certain laws within the Sharia of Islam, and when in the government of Islam, the legislation has to be based on that. So you have a fixed, basically a fixed system that has banned certain things. And this in one hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet, it says the teaching was to take your leaders or your monks as lords instead of God, is to obey them in things that when that for example they forbid while God has allowed it, or they allowed while God has forbidden it. So once your lawmakers make things like gambling, fornication, alcohol consumption, once those things are legal within the nation, then that nation has taken its lawmakers as lords instead of God, because God has forbidden those things. Similarly, if God has allowed certain things, let's say for example polygamy, and that state bans it, or the state forbids it, similarly that state has taken itself as Lord instead of God. So Islam cannot have a system of democracy in which what is popular of the day becomes the law. In fact, the government should have the laws so that people stay within the bounds. You know, the government has a responsibility to God and the society. People are going to commit sin, that's okay. If they do it in secret and all that, that's their problem. You know, God can decide to hide it or expose it. But the government has a responsibility to God and to the fabric, social and moral fabric of society, that it upholds the laws of God. And it doesn't make it so that things get accepted as normal. So if somebody commits a crime openly in public and then they give him a pass, then somebody else might think this is okay. And you reach to the point where maybe people start dressing like with the shortest things. Like people used to dress like that, like the prostitutes used to dress like that, but now it's been normal and okay to dress like that. Or it becomes okay to commit fornication in public. So the government's responsibility is to make sure that that doesn't happen. People don't come to accept this as normal. Now, in Islam also, the Quran tells you about the believers that in their decisions, they have a mutual consultation amongst each other. So Islam tells you cannot make a decision that affects the community, that affects society on your own. So Islam doesn't allow a dictator. It's been unfortunate that you've had a lot of Muslim dictators, but Islam actually doesn't allow a dictator. When you make a decision, it has to be out of mutual consultation. And God, even in the Prophet, we see the example. God sent him as an example so we can learn from him. He had revelations and he was the most guided person. But sometimes even in decisions, they would arrive at something and then somebody else, he would say, okay, this is our course and this is what we're going to do. And then somebody else is going to say, you know what, here's an idea I have. And that person can suggest it. And then they can say, you know what, maybe it's better than what the Prophet said. And then they can go with that, what that person said. So in that, God has used the prophet to show us the example that even him, who sometimes get revelations, it's not like when they say the prophets, every decision they make, there's an angel to tell them what to do. No, the angels they're only sent by God for certain things. They do not come on their own. So they're not always like standing next to them saying, this is what you should do, so arrive at this. God wants us to basically live life normally like you would do if there was no prophets, but here you have somebody who's learned the wisdom and the laws of the scripture. That's the big difference. And sometimes he can reveal what decisions he wants you to take. But through the mutual consultation, which God has said you should do, you can arrive at what God has decreed as the best plan of action for that cause. So God can let you or make you arrive at that decision which he wants you to arrive at, the best decision for that cause, that situation, or it can make you arrive at a decision, and he is the disposer of affairs. Every matter, he decides the outcome of every matter. So he can make you arrive at a decision that he would dispose as a good outcome. So in Islam, there is a leader, and basically, if there's conflicts, then that leader gets the final say. But in decisions for the Muslim state, there is mutual consultation. So that's the only form of democracy that they have in Islam. And then maybe if the leader dies, you can vote for the leader. It's not necessarily that everybody has to come and vote. You see, people need everybody to come and vote because you have a two-party system. Basically, the democracy of the West is a divisive politics. It's divisive politics. It divides the people. Just like they try to do nowadays with what they've defined as moderate Muslim and radical Muslim. So they try to tell you, for example, the radical Muslim thinks homosexuality is wrong. So the moderate Muslim has to be opposite to that. The radical Muslim thinks the death penalty is not banned. So the moderate Muslim has to think we don't have the death penalty, no matter what, even though the death penalty is within the scripture. So they try to divide between those two. And you have certain things, and they try to make it as if you can't have a common ground. So they have the same thing in politics. The Republicans think this way. So if you're a Republican, you have to think that way. The Democrats think this way. If you're Democrats, this is how you have to think. So they've divided the people. Now that is not the case in an Islamic state. We know what the laws are. If you think this is a better interpretation of the law, then you present it. And people consider it and they say, oh, actually it is a better interpretation of the law. This is how we should implement it. So you're one. You might have difference of opinions, but you're all striving towards the same thing. You all hold the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet as the main thing towards the law. It's just a matter of how do we go about making this decision? How do we interpret the scriptures to arrive to solve this situation? That's the kind of democracy they have. And when your leader dies or you need to select another leader, the people decide who's the best person for that job. You do not go in secret and hide. There's no need for that. You're not enemies, you're friends. You can say, this is my friend, but I don't think it would be a good temptation for him. He's not strong in certain ways. And this is another person who is really just. He would uphold the law. Even if his family breaks the law, he would uphold the law. This is the person I think we should have. And then they would arrive and select a new leader. So that's Islam. And in a Sharia of Islam, once the law is not fair, once the law is not unbiased, it's not the Sharia of Islam anymore, no matter how you interpret it. By definition, and by it being the Sharia of Islam, it must be applied fairly and unbiasedly to everybody. So that has to be in Islam, but that's not what you have in most of the countries. You find out that in most of the countries, the poor gets punished while the rich gets a pass. And then you find out that when they get the resources of the country, they do not divide it as you would have in a Sharia, which you should give a good portion to the orphans and the poor and the traveler and the immigrants, but they don't do that. They've divided the countries and have citizenship for each country. And then the rich, for example, if you find oil or iron ore, the rich basically control that and they benefit from that, while the poor get scraps. So that's not Sharia. Some people think Sharia is just about the punishments. No, Sharia is a lot more than that, the Sharia of Islam. So in Islam and the government, there is no divisive politics. There are no two parties. And you find out that in this divisive politics, you know, you can control the people. So the media, if one media, for example, they have Fox News and maybe they go a certain way. You have CNN, they go a certain way. So the media is meant to keep the people basically brainwashed and say, this is how you must think if you're Republican, and this is how you must think as if you're Democrat. So when we present something and we present it as a good thing for Republicans, if you're a Republican, you should accept this. And when we present something that as a good thing for Democrats, if you're a Democrat, you should accept this. So, you find out that when it comes to even things like Black Lives Matter, it's a similar thing. They try to make it as if you say Black Lives Matter, then you don't think Blue Lives Matter, or you don't think White Lives Matter, or all lives matter. Well, here's the thing. The assumption, and it's a very good assumption, is that all lives matter. That's the assumption. But if we've come to that assumption, but in practice, when we implement that, we tend to treat the minorities, especially the black, as if their lives don't matter, then it would bring up the movement of Black Lives Matter, because we're not saying all lives don't matter. All we're saying is all lives matter, but you've not been treating the blacks as if they're part of as if they're part of the all lives that matter. So we need to bring your attention to the fact that Black Lives Matter. We're not saying blue lives don't matter, blue lives matter. And some people think, so here's how I see it. Here's how I try to explain the plight of the African American and most minorities, because sometimes white people find themselves in these minorities. So we're not saying white people cannot be treated as minorities, but look at the history of the black people. You've gone through several hundred of years of slavery, over 10 to 20 generations of slaves, then segregation. People think, because we're so distracted by what's happening currently, we think segregation was a long time ago. Segregation was not a long time ago. It was just a few decades ago where segregation was lawful. So you've gone through 10 to 20 generations of slaves, several generations of segregation and poverty and lack of education. So even the way you bring up your children mentally is different when you bring them up in slavery. Or if you're a parent who had gone through segregation, the way what you teach your children is different from a person who never went through segregation. For one thing, you're a lot more pessimistic if you've gone through slavery and segregation, especially for generations, generations on end. So there tend to be some hopelessness involved. So already that history has put blacks, minorities, especially blacks, at a very, very distinct disadvantage. Now you look at the way the society is structured. All right, the society is structured basically is a modern form of slavery, because in the past, slavery wasn't necessarily that in fact, in Islam, the slave is treated basically, it's just a servant that cannot afford their own wealth and job and income, so they live with you and you feed them and all that, and they work with you. But even the Prophet would tell you that you should not give your slave a work that you would not do yourself or you can't do. And if you give them a work that's heavy, then you should help them. And then, not only that, but Islam tried to eradicate slavery by telling you that there is a good reward for freeing slaves and encouraging people to free slaves. So the idea of slavery was changed in Islam drastically. Now, and that's another topic for some other time when you talk about captives and slavery with that respect. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. But in those days, in fact, you can have a slave and then you can pay the slave master an amount they feel obligated to, and say, I'll pay you this and you can give me the slave, and then you can set the slave free, basically. So basically, you're paying a debt that the slave master feels obligated to be paid so that that person can be free. So when you look at people who are in debt, they're basically in slavery. To be indebted to somebody means you're a slave to that person. You're not free from stress. You do not have, your well-being is affected. So you find out that in this Western world, the people that claim to be the leaders of the free world, a lot of people are in debt. Even to get the basics of life, like medical care, it's so expensive. If you get something serious, you can end up in a lifetime of debt. So you're continuously stressed and you're continuously being slaves. Now, I was looking at a program in Last Week Tonight by John Oliver. They were talking about the incarceration rate in the United States. The United States has more than any other country in the world, more incarcerations than any other country in the world. So the irony of being the leader of the free world. And they were looking at how if you're rich and you get a ticket, like a traffic ticket, you can pay it easily because you're rich. But if you're poor, and let's say you have $100 ticket, now you can't pay that, so now you get in trouble with the law. And then you get assigned a public lawyer who gets hundreds of cases a year. So he has several cases a day, which is too much for any lawyer. So obviously he's going to look for the fastest way to solve your case, which is going to tell you to plead guilty and take a deal. So you don't want to be in prison, so you take a deal that you're going to take a loan from some organization and then pay. Now that organization is going to give you the loan, and let's say you have to pay at the end for that $100 loan, you have to pay, let's say, $200 at the end. And you start first by paying the interest. And I've talked about interest and the fact that this monetary system of the world is not based on gold and silver, and you can look at that post as well. But basically, it's not a just system within the Sharia of Islam to have interest or to have currency that's not based on silver and gold. So you can end up even paying for that $100 fine ticket, you can end up paying $1,000. Well, not end up paying, but you can be in debt for $1,000 because of that $100 fine. And then at the end, you might even end up in jail because you still cannot pay. You were not able to pay the $100. Now you've taken a loan because you don't want to be in jail. So you see, the minority, the poor, and you find out that a lot of black people are poor because of their history. Now, when you look at the societies of the minorities, you look at their communities, their schools are worse than the other schools in other communities. So you have a very low chance of graduating high school. Then, if you manage to graduate high school, you have a very low chance of making it into a good college. So you have a very low chance of graduating from college, and then an even lower chance of having a career and a job. So already you're in a situation that's really, really bad. And sometimes people give you the example that, oh, this guy made it, this guy made it. Of course, individual people are going to make it. Every now and then you're going to find that one out of a million. All right? But you have to look at society as a whole, especially when you're talking about government and you're talking about justice. So you find out that because of the situation, the educational system, and the facilities that are provided, the opportunities that are provided within these communities, there would be a lot of crime. That's what happens when there is poverty and there is injustice. There's a lot of crime. And if there's a lot of crime, the police get accustomed to seeing these people as criminals, even if most of them are not criminals, just because maybe you have a few gangs there, here and there within that community. And even one cop was talking about how he used to be in the drug unit. So he was conditioned to think a certain way. And then once he left there, he started, from looking on the outside, he could now see how his mentality was not the best mentality for justice or how he saw minorities. So sometimes you're conditioned to see people in a certain way because of your training and some of your experience. And that is not, I'm not even now talking about some of the white supremacists on the or the openly racist cops that people that join the police. All right. So I'm talking about normal people who sometimes find themselves in these situations. So you find out that the situation is grave. You have a lot of crime because of the way these communities have been set up, the injustices, and you have the CEOs of these wealthy companies that are pocketing their money and keeping these people in debt, and then the police tend to see them as criminals. So the stereotypes get enforced, and then they hate the police, and it's just a cycle of negativity, a cycle of hate, you know. And because of the injustice, these people stay in poverty. They cannot afford things like to basically get a fair judgment, a fair trial, you know. So it's a situation that keeps them in that situation. It's hard to get out of it. So there has to be changes. There has to be changes in infrastructure. There has to be more opportunities, and there has to be community relations between the cops and the people. And the more you give the people opportunities, the less crimes there would be. The less crimes there would be, the safer the police would feel. And police can have outreach programs within those communities so that they see these people as human beings. Not just menaces of society. So you find out that because of injustice, movements like Black Lives Matter come up. And it's not to say there is blue lives don't matter or white lives don't matter. All lives do matter, all right? And that should include Black lives. And so, that's my take on the topics that could have been dealt with individually, independently, talking about democracy and how Islam oppose or how Islam views democracy or government and dictatorships, and talking about movements like Black Lives Matter. But I just felt like talking about divisive politics and that you have in a government or in a state that's not an Islamic state, and talking about injustices, and how that brought up Black Lives Matter because of injustice. I thought I could relate those in this talk. So I hope it was informing, and anyway, good luck with your search for truth. Cheers.